It was a crisp autumn evening when Sarah and her friends decided to explore the old bridge on the outskirts of town. The bridge had a sinister reputation. Local legend claimed that in the early 1900s, a young woman had thrown herself into the river after being jilted by her lover. Since then, strange things had been reported near the bridge. Phantom footsteps, disembodied voices, and even sightings of a pale black ghostly figure wandering along the edge of the water. Sarah, always the skeptic, brushed off the rumors as small-town folklore. But her friends were eager to test the legend. Armed with flashlights and a camcorder, they set out under the cover of darkness, determined to prove once and for all that there was nothing supernatural about the old bridge. When they arrived, the air was thick with tension. The bridge loomed before them, its wooden beams creaking under the weight of years of neglect. The river below was dark and silent, its surface reflecting the faint light of the moon. As they crossed, the temperature seemed to drop. Sarah noticed her breath forming in small clouds, even though it wasn't that cold. It's just the wind, she thought, but a chill crept up her spine nonetheless. Her friends, equally uneasy, joked nervously to mask their fear. Midway across the bridge, the camcorder flickered and died, its battery drained despite being fully charged just moments before. "That's weird," said Tom, their tech-savvy friend, tapping the side of the device. But Sarah's eyes were drawn to something else, a faint figure standing on the other side of the bridge. She blinked, thinking it was a trick of the light, but the figure remained. It was a woman, her face obscured by long, wet hair. She was wearing a white dress, the hem of which seemed to drip water onto the ground. Sarah's heart raced as the figure began to walk towards them, slow and deliberate. The wood creaked under her weight, though her footsteps made no sound. Panic surged through Sarah's chest as she grabbed Tom's arm, pulling him back. "We need to leave," she whispered, but it was too late. The figure was almost upon them. Before any of them could move, the woman lifted her head. Her eyes were hollow, dark pits of nothingness, and her mouth opened in a silent scream. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and Sarah felt an overwhelming urge to flee. She turned and ran, her friends close behind her. But the figure was faster than they expected. As Sarah reached the end of the bridge, she felt a cold hand grasp her ankle. She screamed, stumbling to the ground. Tom grabbed her arm and yanked her to her feet, dragging her away from the bridge and into the safety of the forest. They didn't stop running until they were well beyond the bridge, breathless and terrified. When they finally looked back, the figure was gone, but the sense of dread lingered. Sarah knew they had come too close to something unexplainable that night, something evil. They never spoke of the incident again, but every time Sarah drove past the old bridge, she could still feel the woman's hollow eyes watching her, waiting for her to return. Story number 2, The Silent Room. In the summer of 1998, Emma moved into a small apartment in an old building. The rent was cheap and it was close to her new job, so she thought it was perfect. The building, however, had a strange history. Several tenants had moved out after only a few months, claiming the place gave them the creeps. But Emma wasn't superstitious. One evening, Emma came home from work, exhausted. As she climbed the stairs to her apartment on the 3rd floor, she noticed something odd. The door to the apartment across from hers was open, though she had never seen anyone enter or leave before. She peered inside, but the room was empty, save for a single chair in the center. The door creaked as she pushed it open, her curiosity getting the better of her. There was something off about the room. It felt too quiet, too still, as if the air itself had been drained of life. She stepped inside, her footsteps echoing unnaturally. As she approached the chair, the door slammed shut behind her. Emma's heart leapt into her throat as she ran back to the door, but it wouldn't budge. The room felt colder and the silence pressed against her ears, thick and suffocating. She fumbled with the handle, panic setting in. But just as suddenly as it had locked, the door swung open and she stumbled out into the hallway, her heart racing. From that night on, strange things began happening in Emma's apartment. At first, it was small. Items going missing, lights flickering, doors creaking open on their own. But then the whispers started. At night, when the building was quiet, Emma could hear soft voices coming from the empty room across the hall. It got worse. One evening, as she lay in bed, she heard footsteps outside her door. They stopped just outside her apartment, followed by a soft knock. She held her breath, waiting. The knock came again, louder this time. She grabbed her phone and called the building manager, but he insisted no one else lived on her floor. "That room has been vacant for years," he told her. One night, unable to sleep, Emma decided to confront whatever was haunting her. She marched across the hall and stood before the door to the silent room. It was open again, just as it had been the first night. She stepped inside, her heart pounding. The chair was gone, but in its place was a small mirror hanging on the far wall. As she approached, something caught her eye. A shadowy figure stood behind her in the reflection, watching her. She spun around, but the room was empty. When she looked back at the mirror, the figure was closer. It raised a hand to its face, and Emma felt a cold breath on the back of her neck. She ran from the room and never returned. Story the end.
Story number 2.
Mark and his wife Rachel had always dreamed of buying an old house in the countryside, far from the noise and chaos of the city. When they found a centuries-old Victorian home for an unbelievable price, they jumped at the opportunity. It needed some repairs, but its charm and history made it irresistible. Plus, there was something strangely appealing about its quirks. The narrow hallways, the grand staircase, and the dark, looming attic that seemed to hold secrets of its own. The first few weeks were peaceful. They spent their days fixing up the place and their nights enjoying the quiet isolation. But it wasn't long before strange things started happening. It began with small sounds, barely noticeable at first, soft creaks and faint thuds coming from the attic. Mark shrugged them off as the house settling or the wind, but Rachel was less convinced. She told Mark she had a weird feeling about the attic, that something was off. He laughed and assured her it was nothing. One night, however, Mark was jolted awake by a loud bang overhead. He sat up, heart pounding, and listened. The sound came again, louder this time, a heavy thudding, like something large being dragged across the floor. Rachel was already awake, her face pale. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Mark nodded, pulling on his robe. "I'll go check it out," he said, trying to sound braver than he felt. Armed with a flashlight, Mark climbed the narrow staircase to the attic. The air grew colder with each step, and an unnatural silence hung over the house, broken only by the creak of the wooden stairs beneath his feet. When he reached the attic door, his hand hesitated on the knob. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and for the first time since they moved in, he felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Taking a deep breath, he opened the door. The attic was dark, the small windows barely letting in any moonlight. His flashlight beam swept across the room, revealing old boxes and furniture covered in dust. Everything looked normal at first glance, but the feeling of being watched was inescapable. As he stepped further into the room, he saw it. A large trunk in the corner of the attic, slightly ajar. That was strange. They hadn't been up here to move anything since they'd moved in, and Mark was certain the trunk had been closed. He approached it cautiously, the beam of his flashlight trembling in his hand. He bent down and lifted the lid. Inside was nothing but old blankets, but as he was about to turn away, a faint whisper drifted through the air, sending a chill down his spine. He froze, his heart hammering in his chest. The whisper grew louder, joined by others, like voices overlapping in a low, incoherent murmur. Mark stood, backing away from the trunk, his flashlight flickering. Just as he reached the stairs, the whispering stopped. Mark turned, preparing to leave, but something caught his eye. Movement in the corner of the attic. His breath hitched in his throat. A shadow, darker than the rest of the room, seemed to detach itself from the far wall and move toward him. At first, he thought it was his imagination, but as it drew closer, the figure became more defined. It was tall, human-shaped, but featureless, a black mass that seemed to absorb the light around it. The flashlight flickered again and went out, plunging the attic into complete darkness. Mark stumbled backward, his heart racing, and felt an icy hand brush against his arm. He gasped, nearly tripping over his own feet, but managed to reach the stairs. Behind him, the whispering began again, louder this time, echoing through the attic like a chorus of disembodied voices. He bolted down the stairs, slamming the attic door behind him. Rachel was waiting at the bottom, her face white with fear. "What happened?" she asked, but Mark couldn't find the words. They didn't sleep that night. The feeling of being watched lingered, and every creak of the house made them jump. The next day, they called a paranormal investigator. When the investigator arrived, she immediately sensed the presence in the attic. "There's something here," she said, her voice tense. "Something that's been here a long time." She explained that the shadows in the attic weren't just manifestations of the house's dark past. They were entities trapped between this world and the next. They had attached themselves to the house, feeding off the energy of its inhabitants. The investigator performed a cleansing ritual, but she warned Mark and Rachel that the spirits might never truly leave. Sometimes, she said, places like this become a beacon for the restless. For a while, things seemed to calm down. The noises stopped, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. But Mark and Rachel could never shake the feeling that something was still lurking in the attic, waiting for its chance to return. One night, as they lay in bed, they heard it again. The soft, unmistakable sound of footsteps overhead, followed by the low murmur of voices. Mark squeezed Rachel's hand, his stomach twisting in fear. They both knew deep down that whatever haunted the attic had never really left. It was still there, watching, waiting for the right moment to make itself known once more. Story the end.
Story number 3.
In the early 2000s, a quaint little inn on the outskirts of a small town had garnered a reputation not for its hospitality, but for the ominous occurrences in Room 13. The inn was a charming place, set against the backdrop of dense woods and rolling hills, and it attracted a steady stream of travelers and curious tourists. However, one room was always the subject of whispered conversations, the room with the large antique mirror that no one dared touch. The innkeeper, Mrs. Hargrove, had owned the property for over 30 years. She was a kind woman, but whenever guests asked about Room 13, her smile would falter, and her eyes would darken. The room had been closed off for years, but no one knew exactly why, until one cold October night. A couple named Jack and Lisa checked into the inn, looking for a cozy weekend getaway. The inn was nearly full, and the only room available was, to their surprise, Room 13. Mrs. Hargrove hesitated before handing them the key. Are you sure you want that room?" she asked, her voice low. "It's a bit old-fashioned." Jack, eager for a thrill, laughed it off. "We love old-fashioned places, it'll be great." Mrs. Hargrove sighed but gave them the key without further warning. When they arrived at the room, they were immediately struck by its eerie atmosphere. It wasn't unpleasant, but there was something unsettling about it. The furniture was dusty and old, and the large mirror on the wall was framed in dark, intricately carved wood. It seemed to dominate the room. Lisa, who had an eye for antiques, admired the mirror's craftsmanship. "It's beautiful," she said, running her fingers along the ornate frame. But as she gazed into the glass, she noticed something strange. The reflection of the room seemed off, slightly distorted, like the angles didn't quite match up with reality. "I don't like it," Jack said suddenly, breaking her concentration. He stood behind her, looking into the mirror with a frown. "It's giving me the creeps." Lisa laughed it off, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She glanced into the mirror again, and for just a second, she thought she saw something moving in the reflection, something dark in the corner, just out of sight. When she turned around, the room was empty. As the night went on, the air in the room seemed to grow heavier, colder. The temperature dropped so low that they could see their breath, even though the heater was on. Jack got up to check the thermostat, but it was functioning normally. "Maybe this old place just has bad insulation," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. That night, Lisa woke to the sound of soft scratching, like fingernails dragging across wood. She sat up, heart pounding, and glanced around the room. The sound seemed to be coming from the mirror. She stared at it, her breath catching in her throat. In the dim light, she saw a shadowy figure standing in the reflection, staring at her from behind the glass. Its face was obscured, but its dark, hollow eyes seemed to bore into hers. Lisa gasped and shook Jack awake. "What is it?" he mumbled, still half asleep. "Look," she whispered, pointing at the mirror. But when Jack opened his eyes and looked, the figure was gone. The mirror showed only their reflections, distorted by the poor lighting in the room. "You're just dreaming," Jack said, though he couldn't hide the unease in his voice. But Lisa knew what she had seen. She refused to sleep the rest of the night, her eyes fixed on the mirror, waiting for the figure to reappear. The scratching sound returned, growing louder, more insistent, as if something on the other side of the glass was trying to break through. By morning, Lisa was exhausted and terrified. She demanded they leave the inn immediately. Jack, though skeptical, agreed to pack their things. As they gathered their belongings, Jack glanced at the mirror one last time, and that's when he saw it, a hand, pale, thin, and skeletal, pressed against the inside of the glass. His blood ran cold as he watched the fingers slide slowly down the surface, leaving streaks of condensation on the mirror. He backed away, eyes wide. "Lisa, we need to go. Now." They rushed downstairs, not even stopping to check out properly. Mrs. Hargrove was waiting for them at the front desk, her face pale but unsurprised. "I warned you about room 13, she said quietly. "You're not the first." She told them the story then, The story of the previous owner of the inn, a man named William Blackwood, who had been obsessed with the occult. He had conducted rituals, dark rituals, in that very room, using the mirror as a portal to contact something on the other side. No one knew exactly what he had summoned, but after his mysterious death, strange things began happening in room 13. Guests complained of seeing figures in the mirror, hearing whispers in the night, and feeling cold, ghostly hands brushing against their skin. Eventually, Mrs. C. Hargrove had closed the room to guests, but every now and then someone would ask for it, and she couldn't refuse. "The mirror is cursed," she said, her voice trembling. "Whatever he called from the other side, it's still trapped in there, waiting." Jack and Lisa left the inn, shaken and silent. As they drove away, neither of them could bring themselves to look back. But Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't truly escaped. Later that night, at home, Lisa unpacked their bags. She paused, her hands trembling, as she pulled out a small, old-fashioned hand mirror she didn't remember packing. It was identical to the one in room 13. As she looked into the glass, a shadow moved behind her reflection.
Story number 4.
Late one summer, a young man named David took a job working at a farm on the edge of a small rural town. The farm was vast, known for its endless cornfields that stretched as far as the eye could see. It was isolated, far from any neighboring towns, and there was something eerily quiet about the place, especially at night. But David, needing the work, shrugged it off. The money was good, and he figured it would be an easy gig, just tending to the crops and helping out the elderly farmer, Mr. Walters. Mr. Walters, a grizzled old man with a weathered face, was friendly enough, though he kept to himself. On David's first day, the old man gave him a simple warning. "Whatever you do, don't go into the cornfields after dark." David laughed it off, thinking it was some superstitious small-town legend, but Mr. Walters' expression remained dead serious. "I mean it," he said, his voice low. "Strange things happen out there at night, things you don't want to see." That night, David stayed in the small cabin provided for him, which sat at the edge of the fields. The wind whistled through the stalks, making them rustle like whispers in the dark. David thought of Mr. Walters' warning, but dismissed it. After all, he'd lived in the city most of his life. He wasn't afraid of some cornfield. But as the days passed, David started noticing odd things. In the mornings, he would find patches of the corn trampled, as if something or someone had moved through the fields at night. Sometimes he would hear faint giggling, almost like the laughter of children, but whenever he looked around, there was no one there. One evening, after finishing his work for the day, David noticed a flickering light deep within the cornfield. It looked like a lantern, moving slowly through the rows of corn. He remembered Mr. Walters' warning, but curiosity got the better of him. Grabbing a flashlight, he ventured into the field, the tall stalks swaying in the cool evening breeze. As he walked, the rows of corn seemed to close in around him, their leaves brushing against his skin like cold fingers. The light grew brighter ahead, but the laughter returned, soft, eerie, and unmistakably the sound of children playing. David called out, but no one answered. The deeper he went, the more the air felt wrong, heavy. The light was just ahead now, flickering like a candle in the wind. David pushed through the last row of corn and entered a small clearing. His blood ran cold. In the center of the clearing stood a group of children, dressed in tattered old-fashioned clothes. Their skin was pale, their eyes hollow and lifeless. They didn't speak, didn't move, just stood there, staring at him with blank expressions. The lantern which had drawn him into the field flickered at their feet. "Who are you?" David asked, his voice trembling, but the children remained silent. A chill ran down his spine as he realized the air around them was unnaturally cold, far too cold for a summer night. And then slowly, the children began to smile. Wide, eerie grins that twisted their faces into something grotesque. David took a step back, his heart racing, but the children moved closer, their laughter now a low, menacing sound that echoed through the field. The stalks of corn rustled as if something else was moving through them, something bigger, something unseen. Panic set in, and David turned to run, crashing through the rows of corn as fast as he could. Behind him, he could hear the soft patter of small footsteps and the eerie laughter growing louder. No matter how fast he ran, it felt like the children were right behind him, their cold breath on his neck. He stumbled out of the cornfield, gasping for air, and collapsed on the ground near his cabin. When he looked back, the field was dark and silent. There were no lights, no children, just the endless rows of corn swaying gently in the breeze. The next morning, David told Mr. Walters what he had seen. The old man's face grew pale, and he shook his head gravely. "They're the lost ones," he said. "Children from the town, taken by the fields years ago. No one knows how or why, but they never leave. They lure people in, hoping to take someone with them." David's blood ran cold as Mr. Walters continued. "You're lucky you made it out. Most don't." Despite the warning, David couldn't shake the feeling that the children were still watching him, waiting for their chance to lure him back into the corn. Every night he heard the whispers and giggles outside his window, the rustling of the corn growing louder, more insistent. One night, the light appeared again, flickering deep within the field, just as it had before. David stood at the edge of the corn, heart pounding, as the faint sound of children laughing echoed in the distance. He knew he shouldn't go back in. He knew he might not come out this time, but something was calling him, pulling him toward the endless rows of corn. And then, without thinking, he took a step forward. Story the end.
Story number 5.
In a remote town nestled at the edge of a vast forest, there was a legend that no one dared speak about openly. The townsfolk called it the Whispering Woods. As the story went, those who ventured too deep into the forest would hear voices calling their names, whispers carried by the wind. No one knew where the voices came from, but those who followed them into the heart of the woods were never seen again. Ethan, a university student studying folklore, had always been fascinated by ghost stories and urban legends. When he stumbled upon the tale of the Whispering Woods during his research, he became obsessed with finding out if there was any truth to it. Despite warnings from the locals, Ethan decided to visit the town and investigate for himself. After all, it was just a story, right? Upon arriving in the town, Ethan checked into a small inn and asked the owner, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Lawson, about the legend. She gave him a stern look and told him to forget about it. "There's nothing out there but trees and darkness," she said firmly. "Don't go looking for trouble." But Ethan wasn't deterred. The following morning, armed with a map, a flashlight, and a camera, he set off into the woods. The trees were thick and ancient, their gnarled branches twisting above him like skeletal arms. As he ventured deeper, the air grew colder, and an eerie stillness settled over the forest. There were no sounds of birds or animals, just the crunch of leaves beneath his boots. After hours of walking, Ethan reached a clearing and decided to rest. He sat down on a fallen log and took out his map to figure out where he was. That's when he heard it, the faintest sound of a voice carried on the breeze. "Ethan." He froze, his heart skipping a beat. It had sounded like a whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. He looked around, but the forest was empty. The voice came again, a little louder this time. "Ethan." It wasn't possible. There was no one out here but him. He tried to tell himself it was just the wind, but the voice was too clear, too deliberate. It sounded as though it were calling to him, beckoning him deeper into the woods. Curiosity and fear warred within him. Every rational part of his brain told him to turn back, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was waiting for him just beyond the trees. He stood up, his heart pounding, and followed the voice. As he moved deeper into the forest, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to be coming from all around him now, echoing through the trees. The forest felt alive, the shadows between the trunks shifting as if something was moving just out of sight. "Ethan, this way." The voice sounded so familiar, like someone he knew, but he couldn't place it. The deeper he went, the more disoriented he became. The forest seemed to twist and warp around him, and soon the path behind him disappeared. He was completely lost. Panic began to set in. He turned in circles trying to find his way back, but the trees all looked the same. The whispers had become a cacophony, overlapping and echoing in his ears. He couldn't escape them. "Come to us, Ethan." His breath came in short, frantic gasps as he realized he wasn't alone anymore. Shadows flickered in his peripheral vision, figures moving between the trees, barely visible but undeniably there. He couldn't make out their faces, but he felt their eyes on him, watching, waiting. He started running, stumbling over roots and branches, desperate to get away. The whispers followed him, growing louder, more urgent, until they weren't just whispers anymore. They were screams. "Ethan!" He ran faster, his flashlight flickering in the darkness, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know where he was going, he just needed to escape. But no matter how fast he ran, the voices stayed with him, calling his name, pulling him deeper into the woods. Finally, exhausted and terrified, he stumbled into another clearing. In the center stood an old, decrepit cabin, its windows dark and shattered. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Something about it felt wrong. but at the same time, it felt like the only place he could go. The whispers were louder than ever now, surrounding him, pressing in on him from all sides. He could feel the cold breath of unseen figures on the back of his neck, hear their footsteps crunching in the leaves behind him. Without thinking, he bolted for the cabin, throwing open the door and slamming it shut behind him. Inside, it was dark and cold. The air was thick with dust, and the walls were lined with strange symbols carved into the wood, symbols he couldn't recognize but which filled him with dread. For a moment, the whispers stopped, and the silence was deafening. Ethan backed into a corner, gripping his flashlight like a weapon. His mind raced, trying to figure out what to do next. And then he saw it. In the corner of the cabin, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure. It was hunched over, its back to him, but there was something horribly wrong about it. Its limbs were twisted at unnatural angles, and its head lolled to one side, as if it were broken. Slowly, the figure began to turn toward him. Ethan's heart stopped as he saw its face, pale, hollow, with empty black eyes that seemed to suck the light out of the room. It opened its mouth, and the whispers returned, louder than ever. "Join us, Ethan!" He screamed and ran for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The figure was moving closer, with its bony fingers reaching out for him, its whispers filling his ears, drowning out his thoughts. "Join us!" In that moment, Ethan realized the truth. He wasn't the first to hear the whispers, and he wouldn't be the last. The forest had claimed others before him, and now it was his turn. As the cold fingers wrapped around his arm, he heard the whispers one last time. "Welcome home, Ethan."
Story number 6.
In the outskirts of a desolate town stood an old asylum, its crumbling walls overgrown with ivy and weeds. Once a place of refuge for the mentally ill, it had long since fallen into disrepair and was rumored to be haunted by the souls of its former patients. The locals avoided the area, telling stories of ghostly figures that roamed the halls and the eerie sounds that echoed through the night. Despite the warnings, a group of thrill-seeking urban explorers decided to venture into the asylum one fateful evening. Emma, Ben, Sarah, and Jake arrived at the asylum just as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with shades of purple and orange. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation and fear. Armed with flashlights and a camera, they made their way through the broken gates, laughter filling the air as they stepped onto the cracked pathway leading to the entrance. The grand double doors creaked open with a push, revealing a dark and dusty foyer. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of mold and decay. They stepped inside, the beam of Emma's flashlight cutting through the darkness. Shadows danced along the walls, and the floorboards creaked ominously under their weight. "Are you guys ready for this?" Ben grinned, trying to lighten the mood. "Ready as we'll ever be," Sarah replied, her voice shaky as she looked around, her eyes wide with a mix of excitement and dread. They decided to split up to cover more ground, agreeing to meet back in the foyer in an hour. Emma and Jake took the left corridor, while Ben and Sarah headed to the right. As they wandered through the desolate hallways, the oppressive silence was unsettling. Emma's flashlight flickered, and she quickly adjusted it, feeling a chill run down her spine. "Did you feel that?" she whispered to Jake. "Feel what?" he replied, glancing at her with confusion. "Like, someone's watching us." Jake shrugged it off, but as they moved deeper into the asylum, the temperature dropped, and an eerie sense of unease settled in. They entered a room filled with old hospital beds, some still covered in tattered sheets. The walls were lined with peeling paint, and rusted medical equipment lay scattered across the floor. Emma picked up a small, dusty journal from a bedside table. "Look at this," she said, flipping through its yellowed pages. It was filled with scrawled notes about patients, their fears, and strange occurrences within the asylum. One entry caught her eye. "The voices grow louder every night, calling me to the darkness. I fear I won't be able to resist much longer." Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from the hallway, causing them both to jump. "What was that?" Jake asked, eyes wide with alarm. "Let's check it out," Emma suggested, trying to sound brave. They moved cautiously toward the door, peering into the dimly lit corridor. Shadows danced along the walls, but nothing seemed amiss. Meanwhile, Ben and Sarah had entered the common room on the opposite side of the asylum. Old chairs were strewn about, and the remnants of a once vibrant mural hung on the wall, now faded and peeling and peeling. "This place is giving me the creeps," Sarah admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Come on, it's just an old building," Ben reassured her. But as he spoke, a cold breeze swept through the room, extinguishing their flashlights. "Dude, what just happened?" Ben exclaimed, fumbling in the darkness for his phone. He turned on the flashlight, illuminating the room again. But when he looked around, Sarah was gone. "Sarah?" he called out, panic rising in his chest. He hurriedly checked the corners of the room, but she was nowhere to be found. "Sarah!" he shouted, fear gripping him as he rushed back into the hallway. The hall was silent, and a heavy darkness enveloped him. "This isn't funny," he yelled, but there was no response. He turned and dashed back toward the foyer, heart pounding in his chest. Meanwhile, Emma and Jake had returned to the hallway after hearing Ben's frantic calls. "Did you hear that?" Emma asked, glancing nervously down the corridor. "Yeah, it sounded like someone was calling for help," Jake replied. Just then, they heard a soft giggle echo through the hall. "Who's there?" Emma called, her voice trembling. The giggle came again, and it seemed to be coming from a room at the end of the hallway. "We should check it out," Jake said, his curiosity piqued. They crept toward the room, pushing the door open slowly. Inside, they found a dimly lit playroom, filled with old toys and dolls that looked like they had been abandoned for decades. In the corner stood a small, shadowy figure. "Hello?" Emma called out, her voice shaking. The figure turned, and for a moment they saw a girl with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. "Come play with us," she whispered, extending her hand. Emma's heart raced as she stepped back, fear flooding her senses. "No, we need to leave," she exclaimed, pulling Jake with her. Just then, Ben burst into the room, out of breath and frantic. "Where's Sarah?" he gasped, panic evident on his face. "She was with you?" Emma asked, confusion settling in. "I don't know. 1 minute she was there, and then she just disappeared," he shouted, fear evident in his eyes. Jake glanced back at the shadowy figure, but it was gone. "We need to find her. She could be in trouble," he urged. They moved through the asylum together, calling Sarah's name, but the darkness swallowed their voices. The whispers began again, swirling around them, each word laced with malevolence. "Join us. Forever." The friends pressed on, their hearts pounding in unison. They searched room after room, but there was no sign of Sarah. As despair began to creep in, they stumbled upon a decrepit staircase leading down to the basement. "We should check there," Ben suggested, determination in his voice. With no other options, they descended into the darkness. The air was heavy with dust and decay, and the flickering flashlight beams illuminated cobwebs that clung to the walls. As they reached the bottom, they found themselves in a long corridor lined with old cells, each one bearing the marks of time and neglect. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of their footsteps echoing through the narrow space. "Sarah!" Emma shouted, desperation creeping into her voice. Suddenly, they heard a faint sound, soft sobbing coming from one of the cells. Ben rushed toward the noise, heart racing. "Sarah?" he called, throwing open the door. Inside, they found her huddled in the corner, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so scared," she whispered, looking up at them with wide, terrified eyes. "Something's been watching me." Ben rushed to her side, pulling her into a tight embrace. "We thought we lost you." But as they turned to leave, the air grew colder and the whispers intensified. "Stay with us." The friends huddled together, feeling the oppressive darkness closing in around them. "We need to get out now," Emma shouted, pulling Sarah to her feet. They sprinted back down the corridor, the shadows reaching for them. But they refused to look back. Just as they reached the stairs, a loud crash echoed behind them, and a chill swept through the air. In a desperate bid, they bolted up the stairs and through the foyer, finally bursting out of the asylum into the cool night air. They didn't stop running until they reached their car parked down the overgrown path. As they climbed inside, they locked the doors and started the engine, breathing heavily. "What the hell was that?" Sarah exclaimed, still shaken. "I don't know, but I don't ever want to come back here," Emma said, glancing back at the asylum, which loomed ominously in the distance. As they drove away, they didn't notice the figure watching them from the window. Lady Eleanor, a sorrowful expression on her face, whispering into the wind.
Story number 7.
In the quaint village of Eldridge Hollow, there existed an old shop tucked away at the end of a cobblestone street. The sign above the door read Dollmaker's Creations, and it had been there for as long as anyone could remember. The villagers often whispered about the shop and its enigmatic owner, Mr. Alistair Finch, a reclusive man who rarely ventured outside. They said he had a peculiar talent for crafting dolls that looked eerily lifelike, with eyes that seemed to follow you wherever you went. Despite the unsettling stories, a curious young girl named Clara decided to visit the shop one autumn afternoon. She had always been fascinated by dolls, and the allure of Finch's creations was too tempting to resist. As she pushed open the heavy wooden door, a soft chime rang out, and the air inside felt cooler, almost as if time had stopped. The shop was filled with dolls of all shapes and sizes, each one meticulously crafted and dressed in intricate garments. Some had porcelain faces, while others were made of cloth, but all possessed an uncanny realism that sent shivers down Clara's spine. "Welcome, dear child," came a deep voice from behind the counter. Mr. Finch appeared, his thin frame draped in a long, faded apron. His eyes were dark and piercing, yet there was a certain warmth to his smile. "What brings you to my humble abode?" "I wanted to see your dolls," Clara replied, her eyes wide with wonder. "Ah, my creations. They are quite special," he said, gesturing to the dolls that lined the shelves. "Each one has its own story and each one is unique. Would you like to hear about them?" Clara nodded eagerly as Mr. Finch began to recount tales of the dolls, some of which were charming and whimsical, while others hinted at darker secrets. One particular doll, he said, was crafted from the remnants of an old forgotten legend, a girl who had gone missing in the woods and was never seen again. "It is said that the doll holds her spirit," he whispered, leaning in closer, "and those who possess her may find their wishes granted, but at a terrible cost." Clara felt a chill run down her spine, but was too captivated to turn away. "Can I see her?" she asked. Her curiosity piqued. "Of course," he replied, retrieving a delicate porcelain doll from a glass case. The doll wore a tattered dress and had glassy blue eyes that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. "Her name is Lily, and she's been waiting for a friend." As Clara took the doll in her hands, she felt a strange warmth radiating from it. The eyes appeared to flicker, and a sudden wave of emotion washed over her. Longing, sadness, and a touch of excitement. "I'll take her!" she exclaimed, entranced. "Are you certain?" Mr. Finch asked, his expression turning serious. "She comes with a warning. Once you bring her home, the bond cannot be easily broken." Clara hesitated for a moment, but quickly nodded. The desire to possess the beautiful doll outweighed any lingering doubts. She handed over the coins her grandmother had given her, and Mr. Finch wrapped the doll carefully in soft cloth before bidding her farewell. Excitedly, Clara hurried home, clutching the precious doll to her chest. But as night fell and the shadows crept through her room, a sense of unease settled over her. She placed Lily on her nightstand, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching her. That night, Clara had strange dreams, filled with whispered voices and visions of a dark forest. She dreamed of the girl in the woods, and when she awoke, she felt an unshakable bond with the doll. It was as if Lily were alive, communicating with her in a way that was beyond words. Days turned into weeks, and Clara's obsession with Lily grew. She began to ignore her friends and family, spending every moment with the doll. Every night, she would wish for something new. Better grades, popularity, even her little brother to be less annoying. To her astonishment, her wishes started to come true, but each time something sinister accompanied them. One day, Clara wished for a beautiful dress for the upcoming village fair. The next morning, her mother surprised her with a stunning gown, but Clara noticed a strange shadow lurking in the corner of her room. It faded when she looked directly at it, but she could feel its presence, a constant reminder that something was wrong. As Clara continued to indulge in her wishes, she began to notice changes in her surroundings. Flowers wilted, animals disappeared, and an eerie fog settled over Eldridge Hollow. The villagers grew uneasy, sensing a darkness creeping into their once peaceful town. One evening, Clara sat in her room, gazing into Lily's glassy eyes. "I wish I could have everything," she whispered, her voice tinged with desperation. But as the words left her lips, the room grew colder, and the shadows deepened. Suddenly, Clara felt a sharp pain in her chest, as if the doll were drawing energy from her very soul. "No! What's happening?" she cried, clutching Lily tightly. The doll's eyes glimmered ominously, and a voice, soft yet chilling, filled the air. "You wanted everything, Clara, but everything has a price." Clara's heart raced as the realization sank in. The darkness she had welcomed into her life was now consuming her. She stumbled to her feet and ran to the door, but it slammed shut before she could escape. The shadows twisted and turned around her, whispering her name. "Lily, please, I didn't mean it," she pleaded, tears streaming down her cheeks. But the doll only smiled, its porcelain face devoid of warmth. "You made your wish, Clara. Now you must pay." In a frantic effort, Clara hurled the doll against the wall. It shattered, pieces scattering across the floor. But instead of relief, an unbearable weight fell upon her, as if the very essence of the doll was still present, binding her to its curse. The shadows swarmed, enveloping her, pulling her deeper into the darkness. She felt herself being dragged down. her screams echoing through the empty room. Meanwhile, the village of Eldridge Hollow fell into despair. The once thriving community began to wither, consumed by a malevolent force. The villagers whispered about the dollmaker and his cursed creations, fearing that they would be next. As for Clara, her fate was sealed. She became a part of the doll's legend, a spirit bound to the remnants of the shattered porcelain. They said her whispers could still be heard on quiet nights, warning those who dared to venture near the dollmaker's shop. The shop itself remained untouched, its sign swinging gently in the breeze. The townspeople avoided it, but Mr. Finch continued to work, crafting new dolls with lifelike eyes and an uncanny ability to grant wishes. And the legend of the dollmaker's curse lived on, a chilling reminder of the price one pays for their desires. Story the end.
Story number 8.
In a small, forgotten town named Ashwood, there was an old Victorian house that had stood empty for decades. The townsfolk spoke of it in hushed tones, passing on chilling tales of the family that once lived there and the tragic events that led to their disappearance. They warned children to stay away, claiming the walls of the house whispered secrets of despair and sorrow to anyone who dared to enter. But one fateful evening, a curious college student named Mia, intrigued by the stories, decided to explore the abandoned house for herself. Armed with a flashlight and her camera, she made her way through the overgrown weeds and rusted gate. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding as she stepped onto the creaking porch, feeling the weight of the house's long-buried secrets pressing down on her. Pushing open the heavy front door, she was greeted by the smell of dust and mildew. The interior was just as the stories had described, walls lined with peeling wallpaper, furniture draped in dusty sheets, and an eerie silence that enveloped her like a shroud. She switched on her flashlight, illuminating the dark corners of the room, and began to explore. As she wandered through the house, she stumbled upon a grand staircase that spiraled upwards into darkness. The whispers began to fill the air, faint at first, but growing clearer with each step she took. "Leave while you still can," the voice seemed to say, echoing off the walls. Mia shivered but pressed on, determined to uncover the truth. She reached the second floor and found a long hallway lined with doors. Each one was closed, and curiosity gnawed at her as she approached the first door on the left. Slowly, she turned the doorknob and pushed it open, revealing a dusty bedroom filled with remnants of a life once lived. As she stepped inside, a wave of sadness washed over her. The room was filled with old toys, a broken rocking chair, and a small bed with tattered sheets. In the corner sat a doll, its glassy eyes seemingly watching her. Mia picked it up, feeling a strange connection to it. Just then, she heard the whispers again, now more insistent. "Help us, please. Who are you?" she whispered back, glancing around the room as if expecting a ghostly figure to appear. But the only response was the creaking of the floorboards beneath her feet. Shaking off the unease, she placed the doll back down and left the room, closing the door gently behind her. As she continued down the hallway, the whispers grew louder, forming coherent phrases. "Trapped. Forever. Find us." Panic rose within her, and she quickened her pace, trying to dismiss the creeping dread. Suddenly, she heard a loud thud from behind her, causing her to whip around. The door she had just closed stood ajar, swinging slightly as if something had pushed it open. Mia hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. Against her better judgment, she returned to the room, peering inside. To her horror, the doll was gone. She felt a cold breeze sweep past her, sending chills down her spine. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice shaky. No answer came, but the whispers intensified, filling the air with a sense of urgency. "Find us, before it's too late." Mia's instincts screamed at her to leave, but an inexplicable force compelled her to stay. She turned and hurried down the hallway, glancing into each room as she went, desperately seeking answers. In the last room at the end of the hall, she found a nursery. The walls were painted a soft pastel, and the crib stood empty, covered in a layer of dust. In the corner lay a faded photograph of a family, a mother, father, and 2 children, all smiling brightly. But as she looked closer, she noticed the father's face was scratched out. Feeling a wave of dread, Mia backed away, only to hear the soft sound of laughter echoing in the room. It was childlike and innocent, yet it sent shivers down her spine. "Play with us." "Who are you?" she shouted, but the laughter only grew louder, resonating off the walls. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and the whispers became frantic. "Help us! We're trapped!" In that moment, the realization hit her. The family had never left the house. Their spirits were trapped within the walls, longing for release. The whispers were the cries for help from the children, their laughter twisted into something more sinister by their despair. Mia's heart raced as she felt the walls closing in around her. "How can I help you?" she cried out, desperation filling her voice. "Find the doll," the whispers urged, echoing around her. "Bring her to us." Mia sprinted back down the hallway, frantically searching the rooms for the doll. She felt a cold breath on her neck, the sensation of unseen eyes watching her every move. Panic bubbled within her as she returned to the bedroom where she had first found it, praying it would be there. To her relief, the doll lay on the floor where she had left it. She picked it up and cradled it in her arms, feeling its weight and warmth. "I have her! I have the doll!" she shouted, hoping her voice would reach the spirits. As she raced back to the nursery, the whispers grew louder, filling her head with a cacophony of pleas and cries. "Hurry! We're waiting!" Mia burst into the nursery and placed the doll in the crib, her hands trembling. The laughter suddenly stopped, and an overwhelming silence filled the room. "Thank you," a soft voice echoed, and for a brief moment, the air shimmered with a golden light. The walls trembled, and Mia felt a rush of wind envelop her, lifting her off the ground. She squeezed her eyes shut, terrified, but when she opened them, she found herself standing outside the house, the door wide open. The once menacing structure now appeared different. It was as if a heavy weight had been lifted. The air felt lighter, and the whispers that had haunted her were replaced with an eerie silence. She turned to look at the house, the Victorian windows now appearing serene, and a sense of peace washed over her. With a mixture of relief and sorrow, Mia walked away from the house, knowing that she had helped the spirits find their freedom. As she glanced back one last time, she could have sworn she saw silhouettes in the windows, smiling and waving goodbye. From that day on, the stories about the haunted house changed. No longer did the villagers speak of it with fear. Instead, they told tales of the brave girl who had freed the trapped souls within its walls. The house stood empty, but peaceful, a reminder of the bond between the living and the dead, and the power of compassion that transcends even the darkest of whispers. Story, the end.
Story number 9.
On a cold autumn night, a weary traveler named James was driving down a lonely stretch of highway, surrounded by thick woods that seemed to stretch endlessly. He had been on the road for hours, and fatigue was starting to weigh heavily on him. The radio played softly in the background, providing a rhythmic backdrop to the monotonous hum of the tires against the asphalt. As he drove, he noticed a flickering light in the distance. At first, he thought it might be a gas station or a diner, but as he drew closer, he realized it was a single lamp illuminating a small clearing by the side of the road. There, in the glow of the light, stood a woman. She was dressed in a long white gown, her hair flowing freely around her shoulders. James felt a strange compulsion to stop, despite the unease creeping into his chest. The stories he had heard about hitchhikers haunted his mind. Ghosts of those who had met tragic ends, forever seeking rides in the living world. But his conscience wouldn't let him pass her by. He slowed the car and rolled down the window. "Do you need a ride?" he called out. The woman looked up, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the lamp. "Yes, please. I'm trying to get home," she replied, her voice soft yet urgent. James gestured for her to get in. She opened the passenger door and slid into the seat, closing the door gently behind her. As she settled in, James couldn't help but notice how cold the air felt inside the car. It was a stark contrast to the warmth of the engine. "Where to?" he asked, glancing at her as he pulled back onto the road. "Just down the highway, a few miles," she said, her gaze fixed out the window, seemingly lost in thought. James nodded, turning his attention back to the road. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the winding path ahead. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but the woman appeared calm, even serene. As they drove, he tried to make small talk. "What's your name?" he asked, hoping to ease the growing tension. "Sarah," she replied, still staring out at the trees rushing by. "I've been waiting for a long time." James glanced at her, confusion flickering in his mind. "Waiting for what?" "For someone to take me home," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Suddenly, the car hit a bump, causing Sarah to lurch forward slightly. James glanced at her, and to his shock, he noticed her expression had changed. Her eyes were wide, almost pleading. "You have to drive faster," she urged, her tone shifting to one of urgency. "Faster? Why?" James asked, his heart racing. "Because they're coming for me," she exclaimed, looking over her shoulder as if expecting to see something chasing them. A chill crept down James's spine. "Who's coming?" Just drive, she insisted, panic flooding her voice. Feeling an odd mix of fear and sympathy, James pressed down on the accelerator, the engine roaring as they sped down the road. The trees blurred past them, and the headlights cast long shadows that danced eerily along the pavement. As they drove, the atmosphere in the car shifted. A cold wind seemed to swirl around them, and the radio began to crackle ominously. James felt as if they were being watched, the weight of unseen eyes pressing against the windows. "Keep going. Don't stop," Sarah urged, her voice trembling now. Just then, a flash of headlights appeared in the rearview mirror. James's heart sank. A car was rapidly approaching, and it was gaining on them. "Is that them?" he asked, panic rising in his chest. "Yes! Drive faster!" she screamed, her voice echoing with terror. James slammed the pedal to the floor, and the car surged forward, the engine screaming in protest. He glanced back at the approaching vehicle, and his stomach dropped. It was a dark sedan, its headlights cutting through the night like a predator stalking its prey. "Why won't they leave us alone?" James shouted, gripping the steering wheel tightly as they raced down the empty highway. "I don't know. Just keep going," Sarah cried, her face pale with fear. The sedan continued to close the gap, and James felt a growing sense of desperation. He turned off the highway, taking a sharp left onto a narrow, winding road that led into the woods. The headlights of the pursuing car faded, swallowed by the shadows of the trees. But just as he thought they had lost them, the engine of the dark sedan roared back to life, reappearing behind them with startling speed. It felt like a nightmare, and James could hardly breathe as the sound of the engine echoed ominously through the woods. "Don't look back! Just go!" Sarah shouted, her voice cutting through his fear. James focused on the road ahead, his knuckles white as he navigated the twists and turns. The car behind them stayed close, relentless in its pursuit. With each glance in the rearview mirror, he could see the silhouette of the dark sedan looming closer, its headlights burning like flames. Suddenly, Sarah gasped, her face going white. "There's a bridge up ahead! We have to jump it!" "What? Are you crazy?" James shouted, fear clawing at his throat. "Just trust me," she yelled. With no time to hesitate, he pressed down on the accelerator, barreling toward the bridge. His heart raced as they approached the edge, the dark water below rushing like a torrent. In that split second, he made the decision. He would follow her lead. "Hold on," he yelled, and with a deafening roar as they launched off the bridge, the car soaring through the air. Time seemed to slow as they flew, suspended in a moment that felt both terrifying and liberating. For a brief instant, James felt weightless, free from the fear that had gripped him. Then, with a jarring crash, the car landed on the other side, the wheels skidding on the pavement. James fought to regain control, narrowly avoiding a collision with the trees lining the road. The dark sedan screeched to a halt behind them but did not follow. They had made it. Breathing heavily, James glanced over at Sarah, only to find the passenger seat empty. Panic surged within him as he realized she was gone. "Sarah?" he called out, his voice trembling. The only response was the wind rustling through the trees and the fading echo of the pursuing car. James pulled over, his heart pounding in his chest. "Where did you go?" he whispered, feeling a wave of confusion and fear wash over him. As he sat there, trying to process what had just happened, he suddenly noticed something on the dashboard. A small, delicate bracelet glimmering in the faint light. It was the same one Sarah had been wearing when she got into the car. He picked it up, and a chill ran down his spine. He looked around, half expecting her to appear, but all he found was silence, the woods surrounding him thick with shadows. Feeling a strange sense of loss, he realized that he had not only given her a ride, but had also helped her escape a fate far worse than he could comprehend. The dark sedan that had pursued them was a reminder of the darkness that had haunted her in life, a reminder of the danger that still lingered in the shadows. As he drove away from that haunted stretch of road, he couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah's spirit would always be with him, a phantom hitchhiker forever lost but finally free. From that day on, James never spoke of his encounter, but he would often glance at the bracelet resting in his glove compartment, a bittersweet reminder of the night he picked up the phantom hitchhiker. Story the end.
Story number 10.
In the heart of an old, bustling city stood a grand, abandoned theater known as the Crown Lyric. Once a beacon of creativity and art, it had fallen into disrepair over the decades, its ornate facade now covered in vines and grime. The stories of its former glory faded, replaced by whispers of hauntings, and the chilling fate of those who dared to enter its crumbling halls. Lila, an aspiring filmmaker, had long been fascinated by the theater's history. She had heard the legends. The ghost of a young actress named Evelyn, who had tragically perished in a fire during a performance, was said to roam the halls, her spirit lingering, searching for her lost dreams. Lila had always been drawn to tales of the supernatural, and with her camera in hand, she decided it was time to explore the Crown Lyric. One foggy evening, armed with only a flashlight and her gear, Lila made her way to the theater. The entrance loomed before her, a gaping maw waiting to swallow her whole. With a deep breath, she pushed open the heavy door, and it creaked in protest as if warning her to turn back. The interior was dark and dusty, the air thick with the scent of mildew and decay. Lila switched on her flashlight, illuminating the remnants of a once magnificent lobby. Chandeliers hung precariously from the ceiling, their crystals scattered on the floor like forgotten dreams. She felt a shiver run down her spine, but pressed on, excitement mingling with fear. As she made her way through the deserted hallways, the echoes of her footsteps filled the air, creating an eerie symphony in the silence. She wandered into the grand auditorium, the velvet seats faded and torn, and the stage shrouded in darkness. Lila could almost hear the applause of the past, the whispers of the audience still echoing in her mind. Setting up her camera, Lila began to document her exploration. "This is the Crown Lyric Theater," she said into the lens, her voice steady despite the growing unease within her. Legend has it that the spirit of a young actress haunts these halls, forever searching for her lost performance. As she spoke, she felt a sudden chill sweep through the auditorium. The temperature dropped, and the shadows deepened, swirling around her like a living entity. Lila shook off the unease, attributing it to her imagination. She continued filming, capturing the beauty of the decaying theater. But as she turned to leave the stage, she heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoing through the empty auditorium. Lila froze, her heart pounding. She looked around, but the theater remained still, the shadows dancing silently. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. No response came, only the sound of her own breathing filling the void. Pushing her fears aside, Lila decided to investigate. She stepped cautiously down the aisle, the floor creaking beneath her weight. The footsteps continued, rhythmic and persistent, as if someone or something was following her. "Is anyone there?" she asked again, her voice louder this time. But the only answer was the echo of her words bouncing back at her. Determined to uncover the source, Lila ventured backstage, the darkness thickening as she moved further from the stage. She found herself in a narrow corridor lined with old dressing rooms. The footsteps grew louder, more pronounced, and she felt a pull toward the last door at the end of the hall. Gathering her courage, she approached the door, her heart racing. Taking a deep breath, she pushed it open, revealing a small dusty room adorned with cracked mirrors and old costumes. A faint glow illuminated the corner, and Lila squinted, straining to see through the dim light. To her shock, standing in front of the mirror was a figure dressed in a tattered vintage gown, her long hair cascading down her back. It was the ghostly image of Evelyn, her expression haunting yet beautiful. Lila gasped, momentarily frozen in place. "Evelyn?" she whispered, barely able to comprehend the sight before her. The apparition turned slowly, her eyes filled with a deep sorrow that pierced through Lila's heart. "Help me," the ghostly voice echoed, soft yet desperate. Lila took a step closer, her fear melting into empathy. "How can I help you?" Evelyn's lips parted, but before she could respond, the sound of clapping filled the room, startling Lila. The walls shook with the thunderous applause of an unseen audience, drowning out everything else. Lila spun around, bewildered. "What's happening?" she cried out. But the applause grew louder, echoing through the narrow corridor. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced on the walls. "Find my performance," Evelyn urged, her voice strained. "I cannot rest until it is complete." Suddenly, the lights went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. Panic surged through Lila as she stumbled backward, her heart racing. The clapping continued, now mixed with a haunting melody that filled the air, echoing from somewhere deep within the theater. In the darkness, Lila felt a presence beside her, and the chill of Evelyn's spirit wrapped around her like a cold embrace. "Follow me," the ghost whispered, her voice barely audible over the cacophony of applause. With trembling hands, Lila turned on her flashlight, the beam piercing through the shadows. She saw Evelyn floating toward the stage, her figure ethereal and mesmerizing. Lila hesitated for only a moment before following. drawn by the haunting call of the spirit. As they reached the stage, the applause intensified, filling the air with an almost tangible energy. Lila felt the weight of the audience's anticipation pressing down on her. She turned to Evelyn, who gestured toward the center of the stage, her expression filled with longing. "Perform for them," Evelyn urged. "Let me live again, if only for a moment." Lila's heart raced as she stood alone on the stage, the spotlight illuminating her as if she were the star of the show. She had never been a performer, but the energy in the room compelled her. Drawing upon her deepest fears and desires, she began to dance, moving to the rhythm of the applause that echoed in her ears. The moment felt surreal, as if time had suspended. With each step, she could feel Evelyn's spirit merging with her own, the two of them becoming one in a whirlwind of emotion. The audience roared with approval, their claps echoing off the walls as if the theater itself had come alive. As Lila danced, she caught glimpses of the past, a vision of Evelyn's final performance, filled with joy and passion. She could see the bright lights, the smiles, and the excitement of the crowd. It was intoxicating, and Lila poured every ounce of her being into the performance, allowing the spirit to guide her. But just as she felt she was reaching a crescendo, the applause faded abruptly. The theater plunged into darkness once again, leaving Lila breathless and disoriented. "Evelyn?" She called out, fear gripping her heart. "What's happening?" In the darkness, Lila felt a shift, a heaviness settling around her. "You've set me free," Evelyn whispered, her voice a mere echo now. "Thank you." With those words, a blinding light illuminated the stage, and Lila shielded her eyes. When she looked again, it was empty. The applause was gone, replaced by an eerie silence. The shadows melted away, and Lila found herself alone in the grand auditorium, the stage bare and lifeless. She stood there, stunned and trembling, the weight of the performance still coursing through her veins. The ghost of Evelyn had vanished, but Lila knew she had fulfilled the spirit's final wish. As she turned to leave, she noticed something glimmering on the stage, a delicate necklace, glimmering under the faint light. Picking it up, she recognized it as the one Evelyn had worn in her final performance. With a sense of reverence, Lila tucked it safely into her pocket, knowing it would serve as a reminder of the night she danced with a ghost. As she exited the theater, Lila felt a sense of closure wash over her. The Crown Lyric had been a place of sorrow, but she had turned it into a sanctuary of hope. The spirit of Evelyn would no longer roam the halls, her dreams finally fulfilled. From that day forward, Lila would share the story of her haunting experience, a testament to the power of connection between the living and the dead. The Crown Lyric may have been abandoned, but its legacy would live on in the hearts of those who believed in the magic of performance.